Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery.
The Sun newspaper, January 15th, 2019, a hot topic, literally. Spontaneous human combustion is real, and it burns you like an incendiary bomb, top scientist claims. So we just have a very, very recent article in a kind of major newspaper with only some tabloid-like tendencies in the UK.
I don't know.
Talking about the reality of spontaneous human combustion and some of the most famous cases. Dr. Brian Ford, he's done experiments with many human replicas to show how it could be real. Now, what's exciting today is that we've got Louis Proud, a Fordian researcher who has written extensively about these strange phenomenon, spontaneous human combustion, sleep paralysis, and electromagnetic anomalies. Louis joins us today from Tasmania, our first guest from Tasmania, and I am super excited to talk about his new book, Borderland Phenomena, Volume 1, Spontaneous Combustion, Poltergeistry, and Anomalous Lights. And joining Allison and I from all the way from Tasmania, Louis, how you doing today?
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for having me on the show.
Super happy to have you. And I'm super happy to hear about weird research and Fordian stuff happening in Tasmania, because the truth is, I know so little about that area besides like the Tasmanian Devil segment from Creepshow. Know about that? And Allison and I saw Young Einstein in the theater when it came out back in the late 80s.
Okay, yeah. It's a good movie.
Yeah.
When I was 12, I thought it was awesome, to tell you the truth. So another one was some Yahoo Serious. So we're excited about talking to you, and just want to, so you get to know our listeners a little bit. What turned you into a weirdo in the beginning?
Oh, okay. Well, I'd say that part of it relates to my experience with sleep paralysis. That's really sort of what got me involved in writing about and researching paranormal phenomena. And that was the topic of my first book, Dark Intrusions, published back in 2009, so quite some time ago. So basically, I wrote that book because I'd been having quite regular sleep paralysis episodes. And that's basically where you find yourself in a sort of twilight state of consciousness. Your body is still still asleep, I should say, and paralyzed, which happens during REM sleep. But your mind is basically awake and you feel more or less fully conscious. And all sorts of weird things can happen during sleep paralysis. They're referred to, of course, as hallucinations, but I believe that there's a little bit more to it than that. But all sorts of strange things can happen. You can have sensations of being touched, or you can hear voices, and you sense a presence in the room, etc. And I know that it's something that a lot of people have experienced. These experiences are not uncommon, but I suppose in my case, I was, because of the frequency of those episodes and the intensity of them, it definitely seemed as though something paranormal was happening. So I thought I'd investigate it a little deeper and look into some of the parallels between sleep paralysis and hauntings and poltergeistry and all those sorts of things. So spiritualism, etc. So that's really what Dark Intrusions is about.
One thing, Louis, really quick, I wanted to get you about your sleep paralysis stuff is, number one, when I had my first experience with sleep paralysis, I was a teenager, or almost a teenager actually, and I just finished reading the book Communion. And I noticed that, first of all, Whitley Strieber has like a blurb on your book. Which is awesome. So how old were you when you had your first experience? And like mine was totally like out of communion. Like I thought I saw the aliens around me and stuff like that. And it was only because I'd read the book and he described sleep paralysis that I did not think I was actually abducted by aliens.
Yeah, in my case, I would have been in my late teens, and that's fairly common for the sleep paralysis experiences to start around that age. And yeah, in my case, it was sort of late teens to early 20s. That's when I had most of my sleep paralysis experiences, and then not long after that, I wrote Dark Intrusions. I had. I've always read, books on paranormal topics, and I think I even saw the Communion movie when I was quite young. So, and then later, of course, read
That's going to scar you.
Yeah, I think it's one of those. Pretty sure my dad hired that movie at one point on VHS many years ago, and of course, Close Encounters and. Of course, saw that movie as well. Who hasn't? So certainly a lot of this material, I'd say that it probably did shape my perception of those experiences. But I always interpreted it in terms of some form of spirit contact, not necessarily something that was extraterrestrial or alien in nature.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating topic for me for a long time. David Hufford's book, The Terror That Comes in the Night, was my first introduction to it. And then just thinking about possible horrifying connections like sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome, and Shelley Adler's work on that, cross-culturally looking at sleep paralysis that goes beyond. And then so last July, I was lucky enough to present in Hawaii at their first paranormal convention, and I was shocked just in the preparation for my presentation to find that there had been lots of sons' deaths in previous years, like in the 40s and in the 60s in Hawaii among the Filipino population. So, yeah, I mean, it's a big topic. I mean, what are some takeaways that you came up with in your book?
Well, I suppose, I always like to, I suppose the most important thing is I always try and give people good advice as to how to deal with their own sleep paralysis experiences if they're having those experiences very frequently. And I always tell people to not get too carried away, simply because even though those experiences can be tremendously frightening and so on, certainly you don't want to get carried away because that's just going to sort of perpetuate the experiences, so to speak. And I think the important thing is to also have a look at your own life, and you've got to sort of examine yourself to some extent, and because anxiety, depression, etc., can all sort of contribute to this as well. So I just wanted to say that I don't necessarily interpret all sleep paralysis experiences as being paranormal in origin. And I think it's probably good to sort of, give yourself a little bit of a distance from the experiences and not get too caught up in them. Because, as I said, it can be terribly, terribly frightening. And I have received quite a few emails from people over the years who were sort of seeking help and advice and so on. And I also think it's important to, if necessary, see a mental health professional as well if the experiences are getting out of hand. So I don't like to necessarily always put a sort of a paranormal spin on every sleep paralysis episode. But certainly some of the experiences do indicate some form of maybe contact with some other intelligence, or, you could refer to it as spirit contact. It basically, what's happening is it's the hypnagogic state. That's what you're experiencing, and it's always been seen as a sort of gateway to the paranormal, because you can also experience other things like lucid dreaming and out of body experiences and so on. I know that Robert Munro, in his books, he talks about entering a very similar state of consciousness to the sort of sleep paralysis state. He even mentions the paralysis experienced in his body before he had a out of body experience. So as I said, I see that as we're really looking at hypnagogia, and which is very much a gateway into all these different states of consciousness and different realities, if you like.
And just a little plug here, you can check out the Sunspot song called Hypnagogic off of our album Singularity, which I can put in the show notes on theothersidepodcast.com/235. But I think that's great advice. There might be something to it, the thing, but if you just have like a weird sleep paralysis experience, like I had a couple of weird ones. Our dad, Allison, remember, he had an experience where he woke up in the middle of the night and told our mother that there was a specter above her that was trying to kill her, and she freaked out, the whole thing.
And she was like, oh no, Bob, it was just a dream. And he's like, no, it was real. And then seconds later, falls asleep. And then she's wide awake all night.
She's left crap in her pants the rest of the night. But, so and I think that's a great advice. You have something. I mean, if you feel like there might be something more, like maybe talk to somebody. Or if you're saying, Adam Gray from the Gray Brothers, they made that great movie, The Nightmare.
Right.
He was so freaked out by his experience, he was compelled to make a film about it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. And, so that's your first kind of weird paranormal experience in your life, or something, realizing that, there's things that happen in our mind, there's things that happen in our body that modern science doesn't have an explanation for. And would you say that was your first experience on the borderland, Louis?
Yeah, I would say definitely, and that is a very important term for me. It's of course I use that in my latest book, and basically it's when I use the term borderland, I'm referring to things that lie on the border or edge of this reality, things that are neither here nor there, but somewhere in between. And I also refer to the word liminal as well, which is really the same as borderland. It's a Latin word that means limen, meaning threshold. And of course that ties back to the hypnagogic state. It's very much, as I said, a twilight state of consciousness. You're neither asleep nor awake, and that's when the paranormal experiences, well, that's when they're more likely to occur. So, yeah, I think that's a very important term, borderland. And as I said, I mean, in this case, this book is specifically about, well, of course, spontaneous human combustion, poltergeistry, and anomalous lights. Because these are all areas that sort of interact or overlap to a large extent as well.
Well, let's get into spontaneous human combustion a little bit, because first of all, I think that it's not something we hear about a lot anymore. Like I remember as a kid, when I would look into the paranormal books, there would always be at least a couple of pages, and they'd have that famous picture. And we'll discuss that. We'll discuss that in a second. The famous picture, which is like the leg, on like next to the armchair kind of thing. Mm. And you'd see that, and they'd have a couple of cases of spontaneous human combustion, but then you wouldn't have that much about it. Like there wasn't that much research into it. And so I was excited. I was like, okay, somebody's looking into it. So for people who maybe are like, well, we know about ghosts, we know about demons, of course, we know about the Ouija board, but what's spontaneous human combustion? Like, can you give us a 101 on SHC?
Yeah, certainly. I just wanted to add too that you're right that it's a phenomenon that doesn't get a lot of attention these days, which is a shame, really. I think it's one of the most fascinating forms of paranormal activity, if you like. But basically, it refers to it's a phenomenon whereby the human body's almost entirely reduced to ash. It generally happens within a period of, say, 10 to 12 hours, and that all depends on when the person was last seen alive and when their remains are later discovered. So it's hard to put a sort of time frame on how long it takes, but it seems to vary from case to case. And it seems as though that person has just suddenly and sort of inexplicably, caught fire, from within, and that their, flesh and bones have been consumed by that fire. And it's a phenomenon that dates back, there are cases dating back hundreds of years, but it's a very, very rare phenomenon. I think that's an important point to make. These sorts of cases are very, very rare, and there are really only a sort of a handful of very well documented cases. But the big mystery around spontaneous human combustion is the fact that it is very hard to reduce the human body to ash, and certainly to the extent that we see in SHC, where the actual bones have even been reduced to ash, because in a modern crematorium, they use oil and gas and other fuels to basically burn the body in the presence of forced air. And we're talking about very high temperatures here. It's sort of range between the figures I have, 760 to 1,150 degrees Celsius. Sorry, I'm not too sure what that is in Fahrenheit. I'm sorry, but basically,
well, it's super hot no matter what. Like if you're over 100 Celsius, it's super hot in Fahrenheit for us Americans.
Exactly, yeah, and basically that takes sort of anywhere between 90 minutes and 2 hours to reduce the human body to a state where, it's been pretty much entirely reduced to ash, but the bones still remain, and they need to be crushed up in a machine called a cremulator. And of course, we need to realize too that the human body is 65% water as well.
I think I have the name for my new metal band.
The cremulator.
The cremulator.
But I mean, that was fascinating to hear that, the bones are, they need to be further crushed down. It's not
exactly.
So it didn't sound, plausible that, these SHC cases, how completely they burned. I mean, that's still a mystery, isn't it?
Exactly. The mystery is around, where does the energy come from? And by what process is that actually achieved? Was the human body being reduced to that state?
Because even if somebody like dropped a cigarette on themselves or whatever, like let's say they're having a smoke and they fall asleep and they drop a cigarette, or that sets fire to the couch, it's not going to burn the bones.
No, exactly. I mean, most likely the cigarette would probably just go out. It's actually quite rare even for a dropped cigarette to actually start a blaze like that as well. And that explanation has been used in quite a few SHC cases, because the victims have been smokers, which is certainly the case too. Was Mary Hardy Reeser, which I know is a case that you were keen to discuss, because that's really like the most famous case of spontaneous human combustion. And if you'd like for me to give a sort of an overview of that case, I'd be happy to.
Oh, that's exactly what we want to hear about Mary Reeser. Number one, because it happened within the lifetime of a lot of people, who are listening to the podcast. It was recent enough where they could take pictures and things like that. So this is not in the ancient past. This isn't the reports of something where they didn't have good technology to research. This happened in the 20th century. So let's hear about Mary Reeser.
Yeah, well, she was a 67-year-old widow of a doctor, and she lived in Columbia in Pennsylvania, but then she decided to move to St. Petersburg in Florida, the reason being that she wanted to be closer to her son and his family. So she was quite a sort of lonely woman in the sense that she had lost her husband, but she didn't like living in St. Petersburg at all because of the heat and humidity and so on. So she was quite unhappy, in the weeks leading up to her death, which is an important point that we'll sort of come to later. As I suppose the emotional state of the victims is something that's very important. But she'd been living in this apartment, a small apartment, for about 5 weeks when it was on the night of July 1st or 2nd. They're not sure exactly when the incident happened, but she actually died. And basically, what had happened is that evening she'd been visited by her son. He was one of the last people to see her alive, as well as her landlady. Her landlady was called Pansy Carpenter, and she reported being awoken. It was sort of early on the morning of the 2nd of July. She heard like a dull thud and then like a muffled sort of sound or report that was similar to, she described as like a door slamming. And she also smelt like the faint smell of smoke, or a very sort of kind of sweet sort of odor. And then,
So she heard death on the way out.
well, she
heard him leaving.
she certainly heard some some weird noises and that sort of thing. So, and then it was later that morning that she went to go and check on Mrs. Risa, because she basically, a telegram had been delivered and she wanted to take it straight to her door and sort of check up on her. And Mrs. Risa had been sort of quite emotional the night before as well. Because basically she'd been trying to find an apartment back in Colombia. She wanted to go to stay there for a while. To see her friends and that sort of thing. And she wasn't able to secure an apartment, so she felt very much trapped in St. Petersburg. And so she, went to the apartment of Mrs. Risa. She touched the door handle, and it was actually hot to the touch. So, and then she smelt smoke, and then she noticed that there was soot on the walls of the hallway. And that's when they came upon her remains. And basically she'd been pretty much entirely reduced to ash, and including the chair that she was seated on as well. She liked to sort of sit in a large easy chair, of an evening, and she was a smoker as well. That's an important point to make. So basically, she'd obviously sat down in that chair that evening, and at some point, perhaps the theory, of course, is that she dropped a cigarette, and that started the blaze. But basically, her and the chair had been almost entirely reduced to ash. The only things that really remained were there was a part of her left foot. There was a chunk of backbone as well, and also a part of her body that looked like her skull. So it was supposedly shrunken. That's always been a very sort of controversial aspect of the case, whether or not her skull was actually shrunken during the cremation.
Now, okay, does heat normally do that? Now, I have never burned a skull, unfortunately. But I'm working on it.
It's on your bucket list.
Apparently, it's more likely to just sort of kind of shatter, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, but nonetheless, I suppose the important point is that she was almost pretty much gone, totally reduced to ash, and there was just a sort of the main thing that was remaining was her left foot, and it was actually still clad in a slipper, which is
right. The slipper didn't burn; the whole chair burns, but the foot in the slipper is fine. It's like a weird Cinderella thing.
Exactly, and yet that's the famous photograph that you'll see there. If you Google spontaneous human combustion, you're bound to come across that famous photograph of the slipper, basically the foot still in its slipper. But it's just such a strange thing too, because the mystery too is how the apartment itself wasn't really badly damaged. There was very little damage to the apartment. So, for example, like the paint was hardly cracked and that sort of thing. There were objects nearby the chair, like even a stack of newspapers. There was like a small bed that she had set up, like a spare bed as well. The sheets were barely touched, so they weren't scorched or anything like that. So these are very, very localized fires. So that's the very strange thing. Another very strange aspect of spontaneous human combustion is that the fires don't seem to spread. They seem to be very localized and just sort of more or less focus on the person, and maybe in some cases, if they are in a chair, for example, maybe the chair will also be burned in the process as well.
Now, was there anything like previous to that? I'm reading this chapter in your book.
Yep.
It really gets into good detail about poor Mrs. Risa's life and how she's feeling, and she moves down to St. Petersburg. So to recap a little bit, she moves down to St. Petersburg because she wants to be closer to her son, and she's a widower.
Yep.
But she doesn't like it because Florida's too hot, and she doesn't feel comfortable. There's not AC everywhere like there is now.
Yeah.
And so she's looking for a way to get back to Colombia. But then what happens is that the apartment that she was interested in is not, she finds out it's not available. So she realizes she's kind of stuck in Colombia for a while, even though she loves her son.
Yeah.
She's not happy
she's
about
stuck.
this.
Yeah, stuck in St. Petersburg and can't go
sorry.
back to the more temperate climate of Colombia.
That's it.
But was there anything like previous to that, like where she felt hot, or she was like, oh, where her body, that there's some story of her like having a stroke where her body temperature wasn't regulated correctly, or anything like that? Or was it just, she's just like, that's it, she on fire?
Well, that's the strange thing is that, they as I said, she was visited that evening before the incident by her son and the landlady, and she did seem completely fine. It was just a typical evening for her. She was her son reported seeing her basically just lounging in her easy chair. She had taken a couple of sedatives. She did take I think it was Seconal tablets. And she had been smoking and so on. So really it was just a more or less a typical evening for her. She was, not in the happiest mood, of course, because of the news about not being able to secure an apartment in Colombia. And the reason I mention that is that there's a theory that spontaneous human combustion is a form of subconscious suicide. Which is quite an involved theory, but I think it's probably one of the most promising ones. And basically that sort of relates to the fact that that most of these victims are elderly, and most of them are quite lonely, unhappy people.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Def Leppard says it right in Pyromania. It's better to burn out than to fade away, right? And so that sounds exactly what these people are doing. But Helen Reeser, now in your book also you mentioned that people associated spontaneous human combustion with alcoholism.
That's correct.
Now Helen Reeser, she was on the sedatives. So like you said, a normal night. Well, I don't usually take sedatives, but it sounds like fun.
Yeah.
And so she sits back in the chair, pops a couple of pills, smokes a couple of cigs. Is she drinking at the same time?
No, she didn't drink apparently, or at least she certainly wasn't an alcoholic. From what I understand, she was just sort of drank socially. But that's true. That's one of the there's this belief. It's been totally discredited now, but there was a belief that alcoholism was responsible for spontaneous human combustion, and that basically these people were sort of absorbing the alcohol into the very tissues of their body and making themselves flammable that way.
So you don't have to worry about it, Mike.
Right. And if you've ever had a flaming shot, you know that alcohol is very flammable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a big revelation when I was reading your book, Louis, that there were all these historical cases of spontaneous human combustion, so much so that, people were coming up with these theories that it was because of the alcohol. And, and also you talk about Charles Dickens and Bleak House and, how he depicts the drunk in that story as burning up.
Thanks for the spoiler, Allison. Bleak House was next on my Goodreads.
But yeah, it was.
Sorry, Mike.
It was kind of a way to scare people as well. Sort of suggesting that there was a link between alcoholism and SHC. Certainly people would have feared that, if they were heavy drinkers, then they might succumb to SHC.
Yeah, so people are using it for a political reason.
Yeah, or
almost.
Sort of religious reasons. There's that whole sort
or
of
sociological.
Christian.
Right.
The women's temperance movement. Oh, no, but the real quick, though, we talk about the historical basis and the historical stories of spontaneous human combustion, but I'm interested in, do you know who actually coined that term, like who actually wrote that down, is like, this is be a real badass name for a phenomena that burns you up like a fireball, spontaneous human combustion. Like, it sounds simple, but it sounds like somebody really thought about that name to make it as sweet as possible. Did you find out whoever created that name?
I must admit, I'm not familiar with who actually coined the term spontaneous human combustion. But certainly it's quite a good description of what occurs, in the sense that, yes, these incidents do seem to be spontaneous in nature, and they do seem to affect only people as well. There are really no cases on record of animals succumbing to, spontaneous combustion. So it does seem to be very much, particular to people, which is another interesting aspect of the phenomenon as well. And that's why I think the subconscious suicide theory is such an intriguing theory, because the very fact that it seems to happen only to humans, we need to look at what makes humans special and unique. And the thing that I would say makes us special and unique is our highly developed minds, our highly developed consciousness, if you like. We're basically, I would say, more sophisticated psychically, if you want to use that word, than any other animal on the planet.
And we're too smart for our own good. We might end up burning ourselves up.
There's a whole bunch of dolphins listening right now. They're like, screw you, Louie.
The dolphins are like, we can't burn ourselves because we're in the water. That might have something to do with it.
That's your explanation.
That's why we beach ourselves.
Yeah.
No, but the thing is, though, when you say subconscious suicide, what I'm interested in here is that this idea that, first of all, you want to die so bad that you blow up, basically. But next, like, what would make it burn so hot? Is there any chemical or anything that we have in our bodies that could ignite at that level, especially ignite to the fact that we're like 60% or 70% water, that could burn through all that water?
Yeah, that's a very good question. My theory on this is that, because the human body is electrical in nature or electrochemical, because, of course, we have nerve cells and muscle cells in our bodies that operate via electrical impulses. I think it's probably what we're looking at is really an electromagnetic phenomenon, whereby there's some kind of malfunction within the body's electrical system, and that's what's actually causing the fires to occur. But we also need to realize too that SHC is linked to poltergeistry, and in poltergeist incidents, of course, we can see all sorts of amazing dramatic things occur, whereby objects are thrown around, and sometimes things will materialize and dematerialize, etc. So we're talking about sort of macro PK effects or psychokinetic effects. And there could be, of course, other energies involved as well besides just electromagnetism, these subtle energies, if you like, that have been termed such things as chi and orgone, etc. And I think there's probably some connection there as well. We don't really fully understand, of course, I suppose how the human body operates, electromagnetically.
I mean, I've been trying for 42 years, and I don't understand nothing about my body.
Well, I'm fascinated too about that. That there might be a connection to poltergeist, because that's one of my favorites topics, and and the fact that there have been poltergeists that start fires. Those are like the scariest ones, I think. And in Italy, about 10 years back, there was that incidence of a whole village that had all these weird fires that were starting spontaneously, and nobody had any explanation, and the city had to be evacuated. And there's a lot of weird stuff having to do with these spontaneous fires. And
let's connect it real quick.
Yeah,
let's connect it real quick. So the idea of pyrokinesis here is that the idea that like Firestarter or whatever, like Drew Barrymore in Firestarter, like you make fires happen with your mind.
Right, like a human agent. That's the role of a human agent in Poltergeistry.
And so you could be doing this to yourself in spontaneous human combustion. Like and the fact that your subconscious does that to you, like you think your subconscious is like fighting against you when you get nervous in public, or you're sweating when you're talking to a girl. Think about what happens when it fires your body so hot. All that's left is ash and your skull is shrunken.
Yeah.
So let's connect this to poltergeist a little bit. How would poltergeists and spontaneous human combustion be maybe the same kind of thing, Louis?
Yeah, right. Well, this is a theory that the Fortean researcher Vincent Gaddis came up with. And it's in his book Mysterious Fires and Lights. He goes into quite some detail on this theory. But basically, first of all, we need to realize that, as I said, in the case of Poltergeistry, it's very much a sort of a subconscious effect. Of course, it's referred to as recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. So, there's always a human around whom the activity occurs. They're referred to, of course, as the agent or focus of that activity. And so it seems as though they're actually causing the activity to occur subconsciously. It's because of emotional reasons. They have a lot of pent-up anger and frustration, and that's a way to express or externalize that anger and frustration. So there's clearly some form of energy involved, and
a lot of time it's around a teenage girl. And
exactly,
if it did. And this is why I almost never believed in poltergeist, because it never happened around my sister Allison. And if you think anybody was emotional when she was a teenage girl, you'd expect my sister to break every dish in the house.
Come on.
I know, but Louis, in your book, though, this may be one of the reasons that you're interested in this phenomenon in the first place. You said that within your own family there was some. First of all, I love the term poltergeistery, and I'm gonna use it for the rest of the week. But you said that in your own family there was a poltergeist experiment. Yeah,
that's correct. So this and this is something that my father told me. My late father, he actually apparently witnessed some of these incidents when he was a teenager. The activity occurred around around his adopted sister, and she was about 16 years old at the time, or a little bit younger, and basically they were living in a house in sort of fairly remote area. I believe it was the Snowy Mountains in New South Wales. And basically what happened was they started noticing all these weird things happening, particularly showers of stones on the roof of the house. So they'd hear these little sort of dings on the roof, and they'd run outside, and there'd be no one around who seemed to be causing it. So that was very strange, and they actually called up the police, and because my grandmother was getting very stressed and worried about the whole thing, and they thought it might have been teenagers or something like that who were harassing them, throwing these stones on the roof. And they had the police come round, and they sort of patrolled the area, and on a few occasions they didn't actually see anyone present. So that was quite mysterious. They were unable to identify any sort of human agent, if you like. And then there was other weird things too. My dad told me about seeing these sort of strange balls of light that would sort of float or hover outside the front door of the house and the windows and so on. So he'd be, sort of his, attention would be drawn to this this strange light, sometimes bluish in color, hovering outside the door, like just behind the frosted glass sort of thing. And he'd go over and open the door, and then the light would just suddenly vanish. And my aunt, late aunt, she was a very unhappy young woman, and unfortunately she later committed suicide. So she did struggle with depression and so on. And this is a recurring theme in poltergeist incidents. As I said, the focus is generally a troubled adolescent. And there have been other cases too of the agent actually being someone who was adopted into the family. So they have a lot of angst, a lot of anger, and resentment, perhaps, against their family members. And as I said, it's a way of sort of, I suppose, venting some of their frustration and anger. By causing these poltergeist events to occur. And they seem to be just a little bit aware, too, that they are responsible for the activity, or at least that the activity is linked to them somehow. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the whole explanation either. I am open to the possibility that there could be other intelligences or entities involved as well, which, of course, relates to the spirit theory, which says that that there are spirits responsible, that they actually attach themselves to the person and they draw on that person's energy in order to cause the disturbances. So there could be, I'm certainly open to that possibility as well, but pretty much in every poltergeist case, it always links back to some living person. And most of these things happen, of course, in a domestic setting as well, and it's an unhappy family. So we need to sort of look at the psychology involved. That's a very important thing. And in the case of spontaneous human combustion, most of the victims, as I said, they're depressed, elderly people. And the theory is, as I said, that Vincent Gaddis came up with, or observation that he had, is that, in the case of poltergeist activity, the energy is externalized. And in the case of spontaneous human combustion, the energy seems to be internalized. And it's, it's basically the way for that person to, in a sense, commit suicide. They're, which I know sounds totally bizarre, but they seem to be very unhappy people.
No, I don't think it's bizarre at all, because the idea that, if you... because to want to take your own life is a very serious decision. It's a very grave thing.
Yeah.
You obviously don't feel good about what's happening in your life. And so sometimes that desire might be so deep, it can manifest itself in different ways. How many people go out and do suicide by cop? That happens constantly where they're like, okay, I can't kill myself, but what I can do is I can go around and shoot up a place and then try not to kill anybody, but get killed myself. Or they drink themselves to death. Or how many heroin overdoses are actually people who just don't want to keep going on. So this is just, your subconscious drives you in a certain way. And this idea that, man, I just don't want to go on and think about poor Helen Reeser. Without her husband, not in the place she wants to be at. She's kind of sad. Sometimes things manifest themselves in a different way. And I like the fact that we're going back to this idea that poltergeists have human agents. Because the past couple of years, I've been like, no, man, poltergeists are fairies. And they still might be.
Right.
But I like going back to the classic 1970s idea that some teenager is freaking out and causing the hail of stones to happen over your house.
Yeah, or the anomalous lights. That connects in, too, with the anomalous lights. The story from your very own family that wasn't just the cladding of these stones on the top of the house. It was also, these lights which were coming towards the door.
Yeah, are you sure Tasmania isn't the borderland?
Yeah, that is really... Yeah. Really pretty cool. As far as poltergeists go, it's better than broken dishes. I would love to be able to manifest lights.
Yeah, I'd be like manifesting bucks.
Yeah, yeah. There are quite a few poltergeist cases where there have been strange lights seen, generally described as orbs. So it's not an uncommon aspect of poltergeistry. The fires as well, that's something that pops up from time to time. Generally, in poltergeist cases, the most common thing, of course, is the, raps and banging noises on the walls and objects being thrown about. But, there can be spontaneous fires and there can be anomalous lights as well. And there's one case that I discuss in quite some detail in my book is it's referred to as the Great Amherst Mystery, which was a poltergeist case that dates from, it was 1878 to 1879. It happened in
Nova Scotia.
That's correct. Yeah, and there was a young woman involved who was named Esther Cox, and she was 19 years old, and certainly the activity focused around her, and it was also well, really well, there's a famous. I mean, the name of the actual incident gets it comes from a book called The Great Amherst Mystery, which was written by an actor named Walter Hubble, who had an interest in paranormal phenomena, and he actually investigated the case because he wanted to basically defraud the mystery, because he'd looked into spiritualism, and he'd found a lot of cases where the mediums had been using trickery and so on to fool people. So he went along to investigate this case, thinking that he would defraud it and expose, the lies and so on. But he actually ended up becoming a believer in the case, and he wrote a fascinating book on it. But in the case of Esther Cox, there were in the house that they lived in, her and her family. It was just a sort of a small, cramped cottage. It was very much an extended family, and she was not necessarily a troubled young woman, but it's thought that she harbored feelings of jealousy towards her older, sort of more attractive and popular sister, Jenny. And the first incident that occurred was when they were sleeping in bed together, and she complained of there being a mouse under the covers, and then another weird thing happened. That's also a recurring theme in poltergeist incidents. There seems to be some kind of creature under the covers of the bed, and of course when you check, there's actually nothing there. So, and these things too also happen sort of first seem to manifest around sort of bedtime. We'll find, like in the Enfield case as well, there was a case from England. It happened, sort of in the evening, and there was the children had just gone to bed, and that's when the activity first started to happen. But in Esther's case, she complained of experiencing a lot of swelling in her body, and she was yelling in pain and so on. So she became very swollen, apparently, which is quite strange. She said that she seemed to be having some kind of fever or something. And then the swelling in her body subsided, and there was a lot of sort of shaking. Basically, they said that the room was shaking and so on, that they heard what sounded like thunder and that sort of thing, and there seemed to be kind of those sort of strange noises. But basically, as soon as the swelling subsided, the shaking stopped and so on. But then other weird things happened, and there were quite a few incidents of spontaneous fires as well. And they'd started communicating with the supposed entity using, rapping noises and that kind of things to speak to it. Apparently, they did hear a few voices as well. But basically, the entity was threatening to burn down the house, and there were a lot of fires erupting in various parts of the house. So that's a famous example of a fire poltergeist.
What's interesting in that story too, there's a couple of different things. Number one is the poltergeist wrote something above the head of her bed. Esther Cox, you are mine to kill.
That's right.
Which is terrifying. And second is that Hubble, he thinks that the whole thing is launched by the fact that Esther is sexually assaulted. So this idea that abuse kind of sets the whole thing in motion. Yeah. And, this is something that we still think about today. Yeah. I find myself even thinking about that in different cases. Number one, because I had a very good friend that investigated a lot of different cases in the Milwaukee area. And he said, I used to believe in ghosts, but now all I do is I believe in abuse.
Okay. Right.
Is I check out, and he'd investigate with a policeman, and he himself had a criminal science degree, and he's like, dude, every time we go to a place, it's always some case of, the boyfriend comes over and touches somebody, all that kind of stuff. Even the whole famous demon house thing that Zach Baggins in his movie, and the demon house in Indiana, that whole family looks like they were dealing with alcoholism, drug abuse, and some kind of physical abuse in it as well. And then the kids go off and weird things start happening to them. And when you look at this case from the 19th century, I don't know if it's my prejudice that I think of it like, maybe abuse kicks things off, or one one human abusing another
Yeah.
either sets something psychologically in motion, even subconsciously, in someone's mind who is vulnerable, or it opens up the possibility for some kind of interdimensional beastie to come down and take advantage of the situation.
Yeah.
And that is the craziest thing I've ever said. But it does kind of sound like, that might happen.
Yeah, no, those are very good observations. In the case of Esther Cox, she was apparently just days before the activity occurred. She was basically, sexually assaulted at gunpoint by a young man that she was seeing at the time. His name was Bob McNeil, which is also the name that the supposed poltergeist entity assumed as well, apparently referred to himself as Bob. So there's an interesting connection there. But basically, she'd suffered this tremendous...
no connection.
So she'd suffered this tremendous psychological shock, and that seemed to set the whole thing in motion. So there's definitely a sexual component at work in poltergeist events, I suppose a situation where some kind of abuse has occurred, sexual abuse of some kind, etc. But yeah, in her case, it was a tremendous psychological shock. So that's what seemed to start the whole thing. Of course, the activity did die down eventually. That was after she was married and had a child. But she was also arrested too, in connection with the burning down of a barn as well. And it's hard to know whether or not she actually lit the fire herself, or whether or not it was caused by the poltergeist. But yeah, it's just such a fascinating case. Because the thing is too, there's, although the activity was connected to Esther, the so-called poltergeist also seemed to act sort of autonomously. It seemed to have a kind of will and intelligence of its own. And in that case, that sort of indicates or hints at perhaps the involvement of some kind of entity or spirit or something like that. So it's, such a mysterious, fascinating case.
Well, and poltergeist too. I mean, there's just cross-culturally and, throughout millennia, there's all these stories. And, a lot of people point to fraud or criminal activity like you were mentioning with the arson of the barn and stuff like that. But or fakery by some of, the agents, in the past. But I don't know, the whole thing is so much more complex because it just pops up so often in so many cultures across time that, there is definitely something going on there. Now, the third section of your book, you talked about anomalous lights and ball lightning. As we're finishing up here, can you tell us some more about that aspect of your book?
Yeah, what the hell is ball lightning?
Yeah, right. Well, ball lightning is basically they're balls of light that manifest generally during thunderstorm activity, although sometimes they're seen during fine weather as well. And basically they're sort of roughly the size of a grapefruit. They can sort of vary in size. The thing with ball lightning is it's a very fleeting phenomenon. So these objects manifest, if you will, and then they usually disappear very suddenly. They either sort of dissolve or they explode, and sometimes they make a very loud noise when they explode as well. It's something that was only sort of really accepted by the scientific community. It was in the late 1960s. That's when it was really sort of accepted. So it's something that was because it sounds so fantastic, I suppose. A lot of these reports were, ignored or dismissed, etc. So it's certainly established scientifically that ball lightning is a real thing. But the science simply can't explain it because ball lightning, as I said, it does all sorts of strange things that seem to I suppose, contradict the laws or the known laws of physics.
Right, because when we think of lightning, we think of, okay, you have a cloud in the sky and then you got the earth. And then what's happening is like the charge in the clouds has more ions. I learned this at the University of pulling this out of my butt, but you know what I mean? Like that whole idea of that there's the different charges, the different amount of ions in the sky, and then it strikes so that the electricity comes down to the place with less ions or whatever.
Right, to discharge.
Right. And then so what would happen with the balls? Like that shows up, and what I would wonder is like, how would that even be created? Like, would that just be the amount of ions in the air or something like that caused by some weird atmospheric disturbance?
Yeah, well, there's been a whole bunch of different models that have been proposed to try and explain ball lightning. A lot of physicists believe that it's some form of high-density plasma, but the very fact that it can, I suppose, even form in the shape of a ball is very difficult to explain. And there is one model that suggests that it's held within a kind of sort of magnetic bubble, if you like. But yeah, no one can really explain it. We may be dealing with a whole range of different phenomena, I suppose. There could be many different forms of ball lightning. But certainly most of the reports indicate, as I said, some form of high-density plasma, which is basically an ionized gas. And plasma has some very strange properties. It's, the fourth state of matter, essentially, is what it's referred to. The sun, of course, is a big ball of plasma, but it's held together by magnetic fields and so on. So there could be a similar thing happening in the case of ball lightning. And it is very different to, conventional or linear lightning, which, of course, scientists have a model for explaining more or less, the charge difference between, say, a cloud and the ground, for example. And, of course, that's a form of plasma as well. But, yeah, ball lightning can do all sorts of really weird things. It can, and I, suggest that people, or certainly in my book, I discuss some very interesting reports of ball lightning, but it can do all sorts of things, like it can apparently pass straight through walls and ceilings. It can leave holes in panes of glass. It can materialize inside aircraft. It can squeeze through keyholes. It can bounce on the ground, and it can enter homes via the chimney.
It's like Santa and aliens.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the ball lightning reports that really interest me are the ones that indicate some form of intelligence or sentience on the part of the object. And those are reports where the object will, say, enter the house via an open window, and it will sort of go into a room. It will sort of seemingly sort of carefully explore that room, maybe circle around a person, for example, and then it will just sort of, very calmly leave the house via the window, or maybe it will go up the chimney or something like that. So these are reports where the object in question is around for a much longer period, because, as I said, in most cases it tends to just sort of explode or sort of dematerialize, but in these cases it hangs around for a much longer period, and it seems to exhibit some kind of intelligent or behavior or some kind of sentience. And we find a similar thing too is the famous Foo Fighter phenomenon, where during World War II,
right.
the Allies were seeing these strange balls of light. They were generally sort of described as behaving in a playful, mischievous kind of manner, and they'd come up to their planes and circle their planes and that sort of thing, and then just sort of suddenly disappear or what have you. So it's been suggested that maybe the Foo Fighters were some form of high-altitude ball lightning.
I could see that because Dave Grohl really, sometimes when he's really playing, he looks like he's on fire.
Man. Okay,
the
so
jokes
what?
write themselves.
I know. Yeah, that's because we're not that good.
Put a drum hit in that part. Thank you.
Yeah. But, Louis, so what do you think is the most likely explanation for ball lightning? Is it, again, something that's directed by a human agent, or could these be entities like some kind of sky beings? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, as I said, I think we're dealing with a whole range of different phenomena. I believe that there are many different forms of ball lightning, and there could be, as I said, there certainly could be some form of intelligent ball lightning, and I think that does link back to the Foo Fighter phenomenon. And there's a fascinating theory. It was a theory that a man named Trevor James Constable came up with. He wrote a great book called The Cosmic Pulse of Life. And his theory is that during World War II, when we were developing radar technology, which is basically sending pulses of microwave energy into the atmosphere, that basically sort of disturbed all these life forms, if you like, these, he refers to them as critters or biological UFOs, these living things that dwell in the sky, similar to how, fish dwelling in the ocean, although in this case we can't see them, and they have their main existence in another reality. But basically all this agitation of the ether, is the term he uses, basically resulted in these beings and objects sort of materializing, if you like. It disturbed these creatures, if you will. And I think that's a fascinating theory because even Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting back in 1947, which really started the whole modern UFO era, he actually came to believe that the objects he saw that day were living creatures. So he was a proponent of the biological UFO theory. So that was his take on it. And he had, of course, a very dramatic sighting that day, and apparently he had other sightings as well.
And so the biological UFO theory isn't just the idea that UFOs are vessels, but that the vessels are creatures in and of themselves.
Yeah, sky creatures, if you want to use that term. Yeah, and so I like to look at the UFO phenomenon from a sort of organic, biological perspective. And as I said, I believe we're dealing with a whole range of different life forms, a whole range of different phenomena. I'm not saying necessarily that these are all living things, but the Earth is a very mysterious place, and there are various energies at work that can give rise to these manifestations, if you like. I mean, there's certainly things like Earth lights, which is sort of connected to ball lightning, but those lights seem to occur around certain sort of geographical regions, and there can be, say, fault lines. That's been one model suggests that fault lines are responsible. There's certainly a connection there between fault lines and the occurrence of these objects, and it could have to do with quartz bearing rocks. So it could be the piezoelectric effect, as it's called, whereby quartz, for example, if you bend it, you put stress on it, it will produce like an electric charge, an electric current. So we need to look at all these things, and that's really the way that I look at the UFO phenomenon. I certainly don't see any evidence that we're dealing with, extraterrestrial beings, and it's all got to do with how we perceive these things as well. And because we're so conditioned to think that we're dealing with aliens, very often that will be what we see. And there could be some kind of interaction occurring as well between us and the objects, whereby they're manifesting perhaps in such a way that they're manifesting in line with our expectations, I suppose. But that's, I suppose, a very involved topic.
Yeah.
We've been talking about that for a while on the show, this idea that really started, for me, the idea started with Josh Cushin's book about paranormal smells. And when they smelled sulfur and everything from demon sightings to poltergeists to Bigfoot, we see what we want to believe. But I had a quick question for you about taking ball lightning and taking it to spontaneous human combustion. Is lightning hot enough to burn someone to ash? That's why I don't know how hot lightning is.
Well, look, the thing with lightning is that it's such a short-lived phenomenon that it doesn't actually really cause any. It's certainly not going to cause someone necessarily severe burns. I mean, there've been a lot of cases, of course, of people being struck by lightning. So even though it's many thousands of degrees, it's such a brief amount or brief sort of blast of current that it doesn't really cause much heating. Generally, I mean, they might have some burns, say where their belt buckle is making contact with their skin or something like that. And certainly the sweat on their body is suddenly vaporized as well, which can cause clothing to actually be blasted off their bodies. But no, it's capable lightning is incapable of causing a person to say burst into flames or something of that nature. So we know that linear lightning simply is incapable of causing spontaneous human combustion, but ball lightning might be capable of causing spontaneous human combustion.
I mean, what if the creatures inside the ball lightning are acting as some kind of weird interdimensional Dr. Kevorkian?
That's true.
Like they think that people are feeling bad,
Yep.
and they're like, you know what? It's okay. We'll kill you. No problem. They come right up to you. They
We'll
set
put you
body-
out of your misery.
Because I just looked up lightning. Lightning can be 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's how hot it heats the air, and so that's really hot, man. Like,
Yeah.
if you got a whole ball of it, like that's it. And the aliens are like, or whoever, the fairies are like, you want to die? Cool.
We can make that happen. Louis, I mean, this has been just so fascinating. A lot of your ideas, just remind me so much of Jacques Vallée or Charles Fort. There's so much in here that's just incredible. What do you have in store for Volume 2?
Yeah, well, Volume 2 is going to focus mainly on mysterious disappearances. It's also going to...
Like the missing 411?
Yeah, exactly. I will be possibly looking at some of those cases, and certainly, some of the I suppose, the better known cases as well. It's very much a work in progress at this point. And I also want to look more into the multiverse theory as well, which is the idea that we live in a multiverse and that there are other, worlds existing parallel to our own. In particular, there's a theory that that these worlds are not necessarily separate, but they do interact to some extent. And there's a theory that some of the quantum effects that have been observed, spooky action at a distance and that sort of thing, as it's referred to in some cases, and also quantum tunneling, and those whole range of weird, baffling effects that scientists have observed in relation to quantum physics.
I'm looking forward to visiting the universe where I'm not a fat jackass.
But there's a theory that it's actually got to do with...
I don't know if we can help you with that, Mike.
But the theory is that maybe the interaction between these worlds is what gives rise to those quantum effects. So I wanted to, of course, further, explore the theory that maybe some of this, strange events, paranormal phenomena that's been observed is actually in relation to the interaction between worlds. And of course, as I said, with my term, the borderland, I certainly see that we could be dealing with some kind of, I suppose, bleed through effect between worlds. So some of this stuff could originate from another dimension, and we're just sort of catching glimpses of it. So that's going to be one of the topics that I explore is as I said, the multiverse theory and relating that to the paranormal.
That sounds good, Louis. And you know what? We're going to have you back when you have that book out. Also, next time we have a good poltergeist case in the news, we're going to have to bring you back so we can talk about that and we can pick your brain on that.
I would love that, because there's just so many questions about poltergeist and, all the other things that you've written about. We'd love to have you on in the future to give some additional insight to some of those news stories that keep coming. I think it's great to have an expert like you who could shed some light on some of the weird goings on.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to come back on the show, and it's been a pleasure talking to you both today. So thanks for having me on the show.
Fantastic. Of course, and if you guys enjoyed this appetizer, you're going to want to get the main course, which is the Borderland Phenomena Volume 1 book. You can find the link to buy Louis' book at othersidepodcast.com/235. In the show notes, we're going to have that. So, Louis, where can we find you on the web if people want to just check out your blog or your YouTube or anything like that?
Yeah, so I've got a website. It's louisproud.net. I'm also on Twitter, so you can find me Louis Proud 2 is the and also on Facebook as well. But certainly, I'd say that the website is the best way to have a look at my work, and there's links to all my books and also interviews and all that sort of thing. So that's louisproud.net.
Fantastic. And you guys can check that out. All the links are going to be at othersidepodcast.com/235. Allison, if they want to find out more about what you do, where can they find you?
Oh, well, they can find out a whole bunch about me at hawaiiparacon.com. We even have our speaker list out for the 2019 event. So do check that out.
That conference is coming up, so make sure you check that out. Now, every week we have an original song that is inspired by the topic. This week we decided to use this topic of spontaneous human combustion to inspire the song, and especially the relationship to alcohol. The idea of firewater. You drink too much, you're gonna blow up, kids. That's the lesson. But this particular song takes that idea about partying, getting on fire, but the problem is sometimes when you get so hot, the fire's gonna burn out. And so this is Sunspot with the paranormal song of the week called I'm on Fire. And you can find that on the Spotify See You on the Other Side playlist, or by checking out the show notes and listening there. Everybody else, we want to thank our Patreon community for making See You on the Other Side possible, making it so we can pay our bills and make sure that Libsyn, the hosting service, is paid, and the domain service and all that kind of stuff. You guys are the best people in the world. Thank you very much. Special shout out to Dr. Ned.
Dr. Ned, we love you.
He's at the level of the Patreon community where he gets a shout out in every single episode.
And I wonder what he thinks about spontaneous human combustion. We're going to have to talk to him about that.
Yeah, we're going to have to Dr. Ned and I are going to have a beer and have a discussion of it, but make sure we don't get any matches while we do it. So the thing is, the Patreons are fun because everybody contributes ideas. We have hangouts. We talk about those things. And we'd love to see you guys who maybe aren't Patreons on one of those activities. So check that out at othersidepodcast.com/donate. You can join us in our Patreon community and keep the fun happening at othersidepodcast.com/donate. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at othersidepodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
It was real. And then seconds later,
That's really hot, man.